Hello everyone, today we talk about Gothic Italy. We're coming back on lots of topics that we discussed back in the day and that we sort of update, expand and look from different perspectives at. I already made lots of videos technically about the Ostrogoths in general, and there is actually way more to tell. Like, we still have to look at so much of their history, also during their migration. There is no doubt, however, that the most important chapter in their history is connected with the Italic power that they obtained by Constantinople, and that constitutes. This is what historiography handed us over, like the notion probably of the greatest, and most successful experiment of Romano-Germanic coexistence and tolerance, right, and cooperation in entire migration era. And actually, this topic is so big. Today we will look at some political and social aspects of the same. I don't know whether I will split this in two videos because it's really a lot of stuff, but of course this should be connected with the general point of not just the centrality of Italy, but of course the role that the Goths had and would have, especially at this point during the so-called migration era, and or this say late antique, right, probably the last part of late antique civilization, as this fresh new force and race that managed to actually rule properly in Rome. And with this very important success that ultimately, ended actually in a ruinous fashion because of the Byzantine invasion and the Frankish pressure, there is a lot in the Justinian reconquest that actually has to do with, of course, from one side, the preoccupation, in fact, of Merovingian expansionism, but also with the intrinsic frailty, if you want, of this other axis that had essentially been led by the so-called Ostrogoths. I say so-called because technically they were the Goths here, right? And just later, because actually of the same Italian historiography of the 6th century, the Goths of Spain were called the West ones because the real ones were the Italian ones. And then so we as moderns began to call, in relation to this nomenclature, the Goths of Italy as the Ostrogoths, because the other ones were the Western Goths. And so, that this is not so important, but just for as a reminder of the fact that, again, the way we see these peoples is sort of more, it's been flattened compared to the actual individuality and role and actual hierarchy, right, in the importance of peoples that existed historically in this very crucial time. Today we will not talk also about the Gothic War, and we made videos about the, for example, Latin Germanic ties against the Byzantines during that conflict. There's a lot of that in theory, in a general sense already before this, because there's no doubt that the Romanity of the empire was seen at this point in a different way, at least depending on the degree of worthiness that the so-called Romans would have sort of displayed. And there is no doubt that by the time Belisarius set foot in Italy, the general forces that were injected in the peninsula were seen as foreign, right? And just the elite was essentially hoping to be re-included, let's say, directly reconnected into the broader Imperial circuit, except remaining in this sort of more or less floridly decentralized position in the central Mediterranean from Constantinople. Things instead went downhill ruinously for everyone involved, basically, and so that's also what the profile of Italy really changes for this point. And again, I made multiple videos on this topic, so you can dig into that in the late antiquity playlist, in also Gothic history playlist. So it's a lot of points. Yes, definitely I can't cover this only say in one episode, but it's not a problem. There's one concept that is, first of all, like the difference that the various Romano-Germanic establishments, regimes, actually had throughout these times, right? One may think, one tends always to homogenize, to flatten a bit everything. Like the Romans were all the same, the Germans were all the same, and essentially also the Romano-Germanic syncresis was more or less all the same. No, right? There were radical differences politically, socially, on a geographical basis that in part were very, of course, were the product of the, let's say, of the single individual migrations, of how they had happened, but also in great part were the consequence of previous, say, levels of development and of, say, cultural identity in a sense. And the Goths, as we were saying at the beginning, actually were the most successful peoples of all initially, until the rise of the Merovingians at least. Exactly because they had managed to win actually the single most advanced, developed, functional parts of the Western Empire: Italy, Spain. One case can be made for Africa as well, with the Vandals, that also temporarily controlled Sicily and also the other main Western Western Mediterranean islands. This is yet another topic, like the complexity that immediately emerges, even as you hear here, by describing like the essentials of these systems that, of course, had, as we were saying, also their shortcomings. We are used to resume in the formula that say that within the Romano-Germanic states, Gothic Italy had essentially a situation that would have been at the same time of sort of neat separation between Roman aristocracy and Germanic military chieftains, and of a longly peaceful coexistence. I don't want to really challenge these concepts, because largely, say in relative terms, there is no doubt that this is true. Like, this was undoubtedly the single most greatly successful example of this, right? However, we also have to understand which sources express this, why, and so realizing that at least in many ways, as it happens often, especially at this time in history, it's not that we really know fully how things were down the line, right? Overall, yes, there were no surprises. Everything sort of makes sense in the picture, but in relative terms. And there are so many technicalities, details, and sort of also practical, say, mechanisms, dynamics that we don't really know about. Like, it's not like at this time in history we know how, for example, these societies were actually run. Like, there is a very interesting branch historiographically of, say, for example, the studying of laws that definitely tells a lot, and there is a pattern. I made multiple videos on this, because these were the single most literate and sort of also legislatively productive lands in the empire as well. There was a great deal of, for example, Gothic laws issued in Italy that would be, for example, adopted later on also in Spain. There was a connection with Burgundy as well. We cannot deny the stability of Gothic Italy, which was definitely also rendered possible by various factors that we are aware of, starting from the maintenance of that distinction between military and civilian functionaries that had been one of the hinges, really, of the cornerstones of the imperial administration, right? This is notorious. Like, Gothic Italy kept being run by the Romans, right? The Goths there as in charge of the military, and there is no doubt that such a great king like Theodoric was that powerful and truly responsible for what was going on in the peninsula. But the entire civil apparatus, on which also the same Gothic military depended, because it was essentially maintained, armed, trained, etc., through the same ways in which fundamentally at least the army of Italy, I won't say the Roman army, because already before this there had been, as you know, essentially a Germanic force, had been maintained in the previous generations. And it was largely intact. As you know, the big fracture in the Italian peninsula occurs during the distractions of the Gothic War, the Justinian plague, etc. So it happened fundamentally that of the, say, group of, say, at least thousands of Gothic warriors, together with actually warriors of other Germanic, sometimes not even Germanic nationalities, headed by a king of theirs, to which, in determinate circumstances, the Constantinopolitan emperors recognized the suzerainty on Italy, spread in a country of some million inhabitants, without essentially changing the situation, like the condition of the white majority of the population, the local population, and in particular without essentially affecting, like without impacting the wealth and privileges of the Roman senatorial aristocracy and of the urban elites. This is incredibly important. We will understand now better why. So I hope also that you're familiar, generally speaking, with the context. So a development of this kind had already profiled itself in the 13 years of Odoacer's reign from 476 to 489. So just before the Goths migrated into Italy, as you know. Odoacer was, as you equally know, a military leader emerged from within the Germanic supporters of the Hunnic king Attila. This is yet another relevant aspect, that is to say, we tend to think too much of the, let's say, of the separation between Romania and not much Gothia, but the Barbaricum in general, right? And so the sense that there would have been just a limit, verboten, no passing, right, that would have separated hopelessly these cultures from one another. It has really not been the case. And I would like really to see much more a history of this continuity, a history of the habitual relations that had existed, say, between Central Europe and the southern one. Now, in the wake of the collapse of that sort of empire that Attila had created in Europe, and that wouldn't essentially survive his death in 453, Odoacer founded personal power of his, reuniting different Germanic stocks, mostly, or helping them one against the other. In particular, in the Danubian area, he, for example, backed the Longobards against the Rugi that were essentially destroyed, and they had to come back to Scandinavia. This is yet also another very important aspect of the war. First of all, how much we sort of overestimated the Huns, at least for those who were especially outside the Roman Empire. They're not underestimatable. But I don't even know if I said something correct in English or not. Every once in a while I invent words. But rather like the capacity of, say, the Hunnic impact on the sedentary civilization, that, as we've seen, is probably very overrated, and sort of became instead historiographically almost like the archetype. There's this other connection with Scandinavia. It would be, I surely make a video at some point explaining like the entire issue of the Goths, their origins, etc. Because while it is true that we do not really have like a direct evidence of their Scandinavian origin, or direct proof, like in a concrete sense, basically everything points towards that, not just to that direction, but to the plausibility of the actual movements, how we have reconstructed them, which doesn't mean naturally that a bunch of modern ethnic Swedes here were essentially moving unchallenged and unaltered ethnically, especially the Ostrogoths, as you know, were like a hell of a cauldron for all the peoples, especially the Iranians that had fallen, especially like when you look at the Bosphorian kingdom, that in fact it is not really what the Goths that marched into Italy really were, among whom you would have actually found many Roman or Romanized people as well. It's a very underrated aspect in the story too. But there is definitely, as I was saying, not just a great connection between Central and Southern Europe, but notoriously between Northern and, not even beyond Central, of course, Southern Europe as well. At this point, the idea that these peoples migrating from the north would maintain the awareness of a Scandinavian origin, right, is beyond the myth that was actually created exactly here at the Ostrogothic court of Ravenna by Romans. By the way, it's not like we know what these peoples actually thought about themselves, other than what the Romans actually wrote about them. And this is sort of the more controversial things, because it seems that the Romans really engineered the entire sort of, especially royal, let's say, genealogy of the Gothic kings to confer them some greater aura of, let's say, heroic, even imperial acceptance in the eyes of a heavily Roman, the actually truly most Roman of the communities here. And that's where the skepticism, in fact, about the usual trope of Scandinavia as the vagina of peoples and all this stuff. But it sort of makes sense that at least the original group had really moved from Scandinavia, aside from, but we know all the story, all the toponyms, or the connections. In many ways, again, that's what they remain. We have a very few peoples that we know of exactly like the Scandinavian origin of, in a reasonably, say, certain way. Right, but there weren't also too many other peoples that were moving from that direction, and I would say that it's not even that important, because indeed what is important at this point is understanding who these peoples, after hundreds of years of migration, had really become. Right, it's important to stress that the Ostrogoths, as we will see now, had remained under the Huns. Essentially, at a point during Attila's reign, you were either under him or under Rome, right? There weren't options. The Germans were split, right, and would fight accordingly also against one another. Definitely the Ostrogoths were in both, say, these Goths, right, were found to be, because at some point they disappear from raiders, right? When the Huns overwhelm Crimea, they, like, we don't say, we know that there were Goths there and around, and they were displaced and moving and whatever, but like the entirety of the people, like sort of that we later call the Ostrogoths, recompact more or less just at this point in the Balkans, in the Illyricum, and from there, like after lots of things that had gone on from generations, sort of they move into the Italian peninsula. We know much better what happened to the Visigoths before. But the Ostrogoths also have, in the sense, this more interesting prehistory, because likely they were also descending from the most successful branch of these Gothic populations, the ones who had created the Bosphorian kingdom, that was really seen as the greatest accomplishment up to that point of any other Germanic people, the kingdom of the rising sun, the blessed by the rising sun, and the fact that the Huns, of course, had first essentially crushed them in say, at least in political independence, and subsumed, say, at least co-opted them to move against the empire, and then these people sort of recoalesced with all the distinctions of the case from the previous group to them, and entering Italy, by the way, by Roman blessing, by Constantinopolitan, accord, would have seemed to continue this glorious legacy, but also in a very different moment that had been the one of the previous centuries. That was really very, 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 very difficult for everyone. Odoacer was another thing, right? Odoacer essentially was not at the head of a people, right? Of a migrating group. Like, he was politically, essentially was a commander that found himself like within the Ravenate, say the last hour of the Western Roman emperors, in the capacity of rising to the top and essentially commanding the Italian army that was constituted at this point essentially by Germanic war bands coming from different peoples. And at some point I will make a video trying sort of to explain like who these people were also, because that sort of fragmentation played a role in all this, but it also expresses the great contact from very different directions that existed between Italy and the various central northern European peoples as well for quite a while, right? And Odoacer had obtained by Emperor Zeno, as you know, the emperor of Constantinople, to have himself recognized as Rex of Italy, at the place of the in the place of the last Western Roman emperor, the young Romulus Augustus, as he was actually called, and Augustulus because, of course, of the fact that he was young and he was deposed September the 5th, 476, a day in which, other than this, literally nothing happened. It's one of the single least eventful moments, changes in the history of mankind, because everything keeps being run exactly in the way it had been up to that point, except, of course, this fiction of imperial power in the West was skipped through, against the security of some smaller but firmer power delegation that wouldn't last however long. Excuse me, I drink a little. Made a video about the Romano-Italic aristocracy that explained, for example, how the senatorial privileges, witnessed, for example, by the names engraved on the Colosseum's steps, for example, are the full proof of the establishment, continuity in Italy throughout all these events. The situation didn't change even when Theodoric entered Italy violently, because, of course, he had to wrestle it from Odoacer. It was not like a particularly devastating war. It was fought essentially in northern Italy, and it was resolved with the siege of Ravenna and essentially the murder of Odoacer after his surrender. The reception of the imperial mandate by the same Zeno, by the way, to rule Italy to the Goths, right, after this 4 years war. The greater compactness of the Gothic contingent in Italy that counted at least several tens of thousands of people. We don't really know, we know that the Austro-Gothic and the Longobarд migrations were the largest of the migration era, but we're not sure how many they actually were, right? Some people count, there were surely close to 100,000. Some people said it were more than that, or even multiple hundreds of thousands. It's very difficult to calculate. In any case, this was big group that, aside from its composition, as we'll see now, had coalesced, had re-emerged under the guidance of this powerful leader, Theodoric that would be known as Verona, so that is the Dietrich von Bern of the great Germanic epos, actually the greatest hero on the scene. This is an important discriminant because, as we've seen again, Odoacer wasn't really, like, it was known as a rex gentium, so of stressing the plurality of the individual groups that he controlled that were mostly truly like soldiers, right? Roman soldiers in the measure in which they had been maintained there by the Western Roman government. The Ostrogoths were different. They were a bulky people that had, like, at least in this specific, say, the most recent continuity, ruled by a monarch from a couple of generations, let's say, or more even, that conferred to this, at least to the elite of this Germanic army entering the Italian peninsula, a specific weight that, of course, Odoacer's composite forces had not had. Furthermore, Theodoric would have been celebrated, as we said in the Germanic epos, as a great king, right? Destined to enter, as a consequence, among the eminent figures of the medieval culture and imagery, right? There is all, like, unfortunately, a lost set of, say, of songs, of praises, of poems that were already sung at the time. Definitely, Theodoric is like the top of all, right? He who would rule in Rome, that achieved this immense power in the Mediterranean, in Central Europe, and that really lived in this magnificence himself, right? If we look at his contemporaries, Theodoric's greatness was seen, in fact, in the sign of a substantial respect, and even more of a full acceptation and exaltation by the same Roman elite, right, and in function of the same ancient Roman traditions. This is a very and yet another very important aspect that actually makes you reflect a lot about what we commonly discuss about the actual meaning of the Imperial Catholic tradition. That is to say that power per se as the Imperium was considered compatible, and this was especially the case after the, say, cosmopolitan Romanity of the empire, in spite of the centrality still that, for example, the Romano-Gothic establishment had, as far as especially the West was concerned. These, as you know, had gone different, more successful directions, statally-wise, but perhaps in this sense properly, the Italian Romans felt a lot more the sort of the more traditional sense of power, what the more traditional sense of power was really about, right? The affinity between the Italics, the Germans, was sort of more resounding than, for example, whatever the Greeks historically had thought and would keep thinking in the Byzantine tradition about the other, right, and the other groups that they interacted with. There is a passage by a contemporary anonymous, the anonymous Valesian, that says something along this line. Theodoric was a man of great, and so here this is exactly the Italian context that we're talking about. Theodoric was a man of great warlike valor, right? He was strong. His father was the king of the Goths. His name was Valamir. Theodoric was his natural son. Also, the mother, Erelida, was Gothic, but she was Catholic. Right. Remember also that the official name of the church is always been Catholic. Like, Catholic has very specific meaning. Also, the Orthodox Church actual name is Catholic, and of course at this time means the only church, right? The Church of the Empire, the Church of Rome, right? And in fact, in baptism, she had changed her name. This was Greek influenced. She took the name of Eusebeia, because this people, as we're saying, were it's not like they weren't exposed to the West to a degree, but the East, as you know, had gradually eaten up its own influence in of the influence of the West in the Illyricum, rather that was fundamentally occupied from then by the eastern part of the, at this point, just like the Byzantine Empire. So these people, like the Visigoths, had been at this point mostly acquainted with Byzantine culture rather than, say, the Latin one. All right. Glorious man in everything dedicated to goodwill, he gave to Italy 30 years of prosperity. This is what the Anonymous says. And peace to whomever wanted to come living there. He never undertook any enterprise that wouldn't have a positive end. He governed two peoples in one dominion, that is, the Romans and the Goths. He was an Arian, but he never attempted anything against the Catholic religion. He organized the circus games and the amphitheater one so much that he was called by the Romans Trajan or Valentinian, of whom he revived the times, while the Goths deemed him in everything to be the strongest king, also because of his edict, with which he gave a foundation of law. This is very important, as we were saying before, like the Germans that established themselves finally in a politically and territorially stable senatorial reality must, of course, create a state, an administration, a law, right? It must be written, because everything has changed compared from the way they had lived up to that point. Theodoric established for the Romans a military service, as it had been for under the emperors. This is also very interesting, because, of course, there weren't just Germans fighting, right? And we know, of course, that there were some Romans that fought within the Gothic army. And at this point also, who is a Roman, who is a Goth anyway? What about the Germans that already lived in Italy? What about, say, how they, say, even in the previous generations, was really boom here? Like, it's not like you have ID, like anagrammatic data or whatever. So we shouldn't be so categorical indeed about that separation. Theodoric provided with, say, the population with gifts and public food, for example. He had found the Ararium all exhausted, and with his hard work he reconstituted it and enriched it. He was illiterate, but in spite of this, such wisdom, that of the things that are said to have and that are still believed commonly today, has had a lot of proverbs have been made. Now, this is interesting at so many levels, and especially the ones that we do see also later, for example, in Longobarд times or in other regions of Western Europe. That is to say, pretty modest but sort of straightforward authors that simply say, look, it's better now. Like, it feels like there is stability here. These people have come. They have strong rulers. They essentially rule from, this is implicit in the thing, from a regional, right, sort of nationally, as in this case, Romano-Germanic basis. And so some chunks of the empire that had sort of historically been enucleated, Italy, Gaul, Spain, etc., and that make things work, right? Naturally, this is just an encomy. Here, the source says, at least still today, this is slightly later to Theodoric, like we still remember him because he was so great and so on. And say the literature of the time, of course, was very complimentary to rulers, or otherwise, like it was typical of the literature of the time in general. Either one source talks positively about someone or negatively. There's no halfways. It's a very different society and context properly in which these sources are produced compared even to the previous centuries of the empire. I'm not going to digress in this aspect, but you see the interesting elements that emerge, like this coexistence, the fact that Arians and Catholics were fine with one another, that the Romans and Goths coexisted, that there was a lot of actually Roman statehood that was restored, that people were overall satisfied, in that also the Goths themselves gave themselves a new sort of order. Apparently, this is just what the Anonymous says. And naturally, there are other and also more important authors that contributed to the historiographical concept, of course, of this enormous positivity. Of course, the most famous one is the counselor and secretary of Theodoric, the senator Cassiodorus. All right. That, as you know, was, of course, one of the single most highly cultured, educated, classically formed, and exceptional scholars of the time. So it was all like a very straightforwardly, like Roman, encoming, as we've seen, of this Germanic leadership for the sake of coexistence. The objective stability that, in fact, was being balanced out between this Roman elite still coexisting next, properly to the Germanic chiefs, like the Consistorium of Ravenna, were Romans from one side, Germans from another. They sorted out, government issues together with the king, right? So there was a level of parity. This was felt. So it was so important because for the Romans, like having sort of civilized the barbarians, having elevated them to Roman greatness was, as you know, the greatest imperial Catholic traditional accomplishment that the same Germans here felt enormously for and privileged by. Theodoric has this immense reverence towards the Romans. Also, the first thing he does, even as an Arian, when he seizes control of Italy, after killing Odoacer, is to go to Rome to revere the Pope, right? This tells you also how powerful the church already was, next to essentially the senators that expressed the same background of the main prelates, right? And there is a functional Romanity, a functional antiquity. Cities work, the state works, the administration works, and as we've seen, the Germans contribute decisively to the military, right? And so this care for the decorum and the functionality of the city, especially the care for fountains and aqueducts, besides as we've seen, also the games, right? The infrastructures for entertainment, the subordination of the prince to the laws, the religious tolerance. These were all founded on the principle that also nobody can really be obliged, for example, to believe against his own will. And this all went, right, in favor of both groups, safeguarding the aristocracies. And if you think about it, like first and foremost, like to the advantage of the Roman senators, not even the Goths overall, right? Because there was a great deal at this point also of it's a bit complicated to explain. It's not what we're going to talk about today. But from one side, through the senatorization, many Goths became sort of less politically relevant than they had previously been in the Barbaricum. And on the other side, you have a Gothic elite at this point, in fact, that conversely becomes way more powerful, and that is divided regarding what to do about the current direction towards the rest of the empire, towards the Roman administration. And this, agitation would actually shatter the order in the later Ostrogothic period, also triggering the Byzantine intervention once the, Constantinople some sense of such frailty had been spotted. Right, Theodoric in many ways was the guy who managed to keep the entire system together, and it would be very, very interesting to study more in depth on Schwerpunkt such say how his role was metaphysically framed in the Roman view as well, because we can sort of understand through that also how the Germans would have seen this. Now, on this general rhetorical background was grafted what would have been both in the life of Theodoric and after his death occurred in 526, and in the difficult moments, the dominant theme of the supporters of the Gothic dominion in Italy. That is, the peaceful coexistence granted between the Goths and the Romans, its foundation on the orderly dichotomy between a legislative administrative power and a military one, in Nodius Cassiodorus, the so-called Anonymous Valesianus, and indirectly the same Procopius of Caesarea, the most famous Byzantine author of the Justinian era, would have essentially spoken of the peaceful way and also the painless one with which the Germanic military element had settled in Italy, right? With this domination had been established, and of the quiet siding of the Gothic soldier and the Roman civilian. So, very important picture that we get basically from all the historiography, both the local Italians, the Byzantines, Constantinople, and of course, as we were saying before, this is basically all, right? The rest of Europe and the Mediterranean wasn't providing with some sort of better insight, simply because these were the most advanced areas of the broader region, of the continent here, which already by itself sort of tells you how relevant, given the high level of civilization, such a positive encounter with the with the gods really was. All right, when you look again at the entire picture, you realize that this Gothic presence was, in a military sense, if you want, not even so enormously different from the one that, it doesn't really find other historical parallels in Italy specifically. This is similar, of course, to what happened to other areas of Europe during the migration era. But it really shows how, after all, there would have not been even a way for these people, or a reason for that matter, to destabilize the system, to destroy it, to simply tyrannize it, or to sabotage the Roman structure. That is not to be seen. Of course, towards the Gothic wars, there is an increased distrust between the Roman elite and the Gothic one, but it's not one that causes the collapse of the system per se, right? If the Byzantines had not invaded, which of course was something that actually was highly successful at the beginning, right? Had things been managed by Belisarius all along, hadn't it been removed, etc., Italy would have not even gone destroyed during the war. So that shows as well that this is true also for other contexts, like the Germanic capacity of controlling these systems that were overwhelmingly Roman, even just from a sheer demographic point of view, wasn't that, in fact, impositive, wasn't that something that could simply be coerced, right? On the contrary, what allows the Gothic coming back in Italy is the support of the same Italians that were promised later on in the war, essentially to witness the not much just the equation to the Germans, let's say essentially the freeing from their, because there is also this question mark, what was the actual, even what we just said regarding the non-tyrannic nature of this Germanic rule, like what was really the difference between Romans and Germans so important? Were these Germans really conquerors that had subjected the Romans? If anything, the Romans were already largely colonists in the latifundia of the great Roman senators, as we've seen, and that's what the Goths make leverage on in the later stages of the war to get new recruits. We will free you from your essentially de facto servile condition compared to your masters if you join the war with us against essentially them, because the Byzantines were back in essentially the elite in the perpetuation of the same latifundium system. I've made multiple videos about post-Gothic War Italy, not just the one on the Longobards that naturally change a bit everything. Well, not too much. That's one of the hard to die myths that I in part debunk myself. It's not true that the Longobards, as overwhelmingly successful as they were, actually were just, say, surpassing the Roman system at all. This had, if anything, already transformed itself to a degree that favored that integration. But also post-Gothic War Byzantine Italy, which is something we'll have to come back on because it's sort of underrated in its, not much in its Byzantine character, but in fact in its Italic character, and how the Byzantines fundamentally had to witness, even in that sense, like a an irreversible at some point process of decentralization and further autonomization of these communities. Now, documentarily speaking, it's not easy at all, as you can imagine, given the scarcity of epigraphic and documentary sources, to, say, separate the purely ideological and propagandistic element that we have read from these authors that are all, by the way, sort of high literate, like they're, as we were saying before, there isn't really much, just given the social landscape, just a random guy writing stuff about what was going on in Gothic Italy, right? And so they reflect largely the hierarchical nature of the society. To separate it from these characteristics from the objective foundation of the same complex of literary writings that basically are almost all what we have about Gothic Italy. I made a video about the limits of archaeology during the 6th, the 7th century in reconstructing even the Mediterranean world that was by far, say, the more, say, productive of such archaeological evidence, just by wealth and, say, social complexity. And so that's a point I've always made on Schwerpunkt. Realize that we truly are depending for better, and it's really, believe me, much for the better, but also for the worse sometimes, on just historiography, on documentary sources, and as we've seen, not that many. And so in a sense it's a disadvantage, but it's also an advantage, because when you read these sources, you can, for this period, just realize that few that you have and that you're sort of mandatorily, say, dealing with, and to listen to it and to realize how actually insightful narrative sources really are, documentary sources in general. There aren't doubts, however, on some elements that would actually support this coexistence between the Romans and the Germans. First of all, as we have seen, already the numerical scarcity of the Goths compared to the populations that were, counting the millions, like in these regions of Southern Europe, and that were just even sort of very advanced, also materially speaking. This don't think that when we say the majority of the Italian population were colonists, this means that these people were sort of in a worse condition than basically anyone that we can think around, right? Nor the Byzantines, nor the Germans. Italy maintained continuously, from uninterruptedly, even in the darkest sort of post-Gothic war phase, the highest per capita wealth in the world, right? From Roman times to the late 17th century. So this wasn't like a prison, a terroristic regime that the Goths were sort of just to abide by because, they had the formula to make people live better, but the Romans were too strong. And that's not a narrative, right? Many people, unfortunately, interpret history in general in very imaginative fantasy fashion, and there is all a level of diseducation, unfortunately, that our culture has brought people to that really is thinking that history is some sort of matter of subjective speculation rather than actually hard evidence. We also have to understand that Theodoric's reign entailed still a imperial character, of which Italy was the center. Still, right? This is very true. Also in the worst period of the last emperors of Ravenna, right? Italy was by far the more advanced and still politically capable, still politically dynamic country in the West. Gaul was bigger overall, but it was also a big territory that not even the Merovingians technically managed to control entirely. Right, Gaul was richer than Italy in absolute terms of resources, but Italy was better structured, had a higher per capita wealth, as we've seen, and under Majorianus, for example, had showed how it could still simply retake the entirety of Spain still, and we're in the 60s of the 5th century, so you have to understand how important it was. And when you realize the continuity that we were talking about with late antiquity, you can't, of course, avoid to notice that Theodoric was ruling from Italy, but he was controlling Provence, that conquered, for example, in his life, Rhaetia, Noricum, Istria, Dalmatia, the Drava and Sava valleys, right, in Central Europe, in the Balkans, and during brief time, even, right, the Ostrogothic rule famously extended as a sort of protectorate slash dominion over Visigothic Spain during an age of minority of the local ruler. I will talk about this better. Without mentioning all the Gothic system that had been established with essentially this Arian pagan axis against sort of the Catholic one represented by the Merovingian Franks and Constantinople, plus the Vandals, albeit being Arians, were so more directly threatened in Tunisia by the Italian dominion that preferred to side with nobody, because eventually they were taken out by the same Belisarius, but all but, let's say, the Ostrogoths that had also sort of expelled them from Sicily when Theodoric had taken over the Italian peninsula. The Provence thing is very interesting because it shows that when an Italian power is compact, actually, like during the Middle Ages, it tends to expand towards Provence as well. That is also a bit like a gateway towards, like, the, say, Septimania the same Spain as we've seen. It was a thing, right? These were heavily Romanized areas and very urbanized, very similar to Italy, actually. And that also the later centuries would maintain an important connection with the same. So Theodoric was essentially resuming an ancient imperial tradition, not just of Rome, but of the same gods that in the 4th and the 5th century, before having been overwhelmed, as we've seen, by the Hunnic pressure, had actually experimented something similar, but very, say, different actually, but still very important in that direction, as the best of the Germans. Remember that sometimes the Goths were called Goths and the Germans were called Germans, right? The Goths were almost so important that there were people on their own, and surely they also had an importantly different ethnogenesis with a great Iranian injection, as we've seen in one of our people, and this had brought them while still in Barbaricum to hegemonize Neo-Latin, Germanic, and Slavic populations. This is what essentially also Theodoric's Goths were before entering Italy. There were all these components and more within their group. And so, aside from the ups and downs of, as we've seen, this Gothic power, there had always been a sense that, as we said before, that the Goths had been the most aggressive, successful, and prestigious of the Barbaricum sort of sedentary de facto, if you want, semi-nomadic peoples in the European continent. Now, the fact that in a moment of such imperial push, Gothic king would express, as far as we know, at least through the aforementioned historiography, the in fact apparent will of counterposing a Gothia to a Romania must be read not as a form of national counterposition at all, but as a form of concurrence between empires, that is to say, between systems founded exactly on the coalescence of very different nations and on the substantial maintenance and respect of such diversity. This is very evident in Ostrogothic Italy. First of all, the Romans had, like in the moment in which they were also, say, after Adrianople, about all the Theodosian propaganda, like saying, look what we did, we transformed the Goths, these barbarians, into actual Roman soldiers and subjects, right? This was a very old motive in imperial policy. It was truly the affirmation of imperial Catholic superiority over the world, right? Here, what Theodoric was doing was essentially doing the same under a Gothic leadership. In Italy, you've seen all the tolerance, all the fact the Arians and Catholics left each other alone. And objectively, yes, we don't have evidence of such persecutions. It's true that these were probably not really such an enormous deal, especially down the line, that the population. Also in other countries, it was mostly like just a clothed elite, ideal, rather than an actually theological or deeply sort of, supranationally dividing issue. Theodoric actually showed that he could be an Arian leader, even winking at the pagans of Central Europe that were being threatened by Merovingian expansionism. So the thing is more complicated. But the sense being, without any doubt, that the success of Goths and Romans in this competition was not due on, say, the Gothicization in an ethnic sense, which could have, like of the Roman people, which would have not been possible at this point. Actually, It would become possible in other areas of Europe, even in Italy with the Longobards, but after, as we've seen, late antiquity had died, and so this Roman system had collapsed. But of course, with people that spoke Roman, and with Germans that legislated in Latin and that basically were assimilated in a couple of generations to the local majority. But the proof that essentially you were imperially superior to rule on different peoples at the same time. And if you look at the list here of lands that Theodoric ruled over, you realize how also complex the population, say, the background really was historically also. This various lands: Italy, Provence, Arezzo, Noricum, Dalmatia, the Drava and Sava valleys. This was a very big chunk. Theodoric's reign arrived up to the Danube, also at the gates of what was Germany, in fact. And it's incredibly important, even just to understand the range of political and strategical organization that the Goths really had from the Italian peninsula, from Ravenna, from the same court that had belonged to the Western Roman emperors. So it's this range, this scale of political vision that should be stressed, not much a substantially national one. You can argue that actually this was the reason why the Goths failed, and the Franks sort of stripped their rule, even in imperial sense, of Europe, right? In the sort of, I made a video about this specifically. In part it was also Arianism, in part it was the fact that the latter had been so deeply ingrained among people like the Goths, because they had Huns or not Huns counterposed themselves the most in Europe against the empire originally, especially the Ostrogoths that, as we've seen, had remained the longest outside of the Roman Empire. That this couldn't simply be together with this supranational power, right, simply eliminated. The Franks created an empire because they subjugated different peoples, and that they decentralized, they ruled in a decentralized fashion, while establishing a significantly compact realm that was in part also their originary one. Austrasia, right, was truly Germanic, at least, if not entirely Frankish. That can be debated, but that's the point. Neustria, of course, was Romance, and it actually ended up being the real center of power of the Franks. But it had sort of developed immediately very different characteristics from the ones of the full late antiquity. It's not because they wouldn't agree, actually, with the Gallo-Roman senatorial and episcopal elite. They could rule as a monarchy, as an empire, exclusively because of that, together, of course, with the conversion, not even from Arianism to Catholicism, from literal paganism to Catholicism, but also the fact that Northern Gaul was much less, it had witnessed at least a higher degree of, of decay, of Romanity. And we're talking especially from an infrastructural point of view. It's not that these places weren't Roman, but they also were more depopulated. The Franks had a larger impact also ethnically. So even though they remained Romans, they sort of changed also in mindset faster, right? Definitely the Goths would have never given up the Romanity of their possessions, because, as we've seen, Italy and Spain were by far the most advanced lands in the West. In any case, the premises of Gothic power were heavily framed within and dependent on the Roman legitimization of their rule, right? There is a directly and indirectly, internationally and locally, right? The Goths were dependent on this Italian dominion, and ultimately they would be essentially crushed by Constantinople. This again, as powerful as especially Theodoric's Italy really was, we should not forget again that there is a substratum that continues along this sort of idea of Gothic functionality to Romanity, rather than a Gothic conquest and subjugation of Romanity. Right. Another important aspect is in fact, financing of the Gothic military force. Right. This is exactly the cornerstone of the last process. This was actually not even very innovative. It had been there since the time. In fact, the Visigoths had entered as a single people, as a wall people, right, that could settle, controlling essentially an imperial province at a time. So we're talking from the 4th to the 6th century. Every time that the emperors could in some way manage the movements of peoples and armies, of barbarian peoples and armies, to the Germanic newcomers committed to the exercise of war, right? Because they were heavily militarized by just the necessities of the migration, and what their lifestyle had also, generally speaking, always been in the barbaricum, weren't given, actually, and this is often a misunderstood aspect of the Hospitalitas, actual lands subtracted to actual owners residing from an old age to a certain community, and even less, actually, from the aristocratic landowners. All right, so the actual mechanism behind the Hospitalitas was the consolidated one of devolving, in this case to the Gothic warriors settled as hospites, the landed revenue that was already owed to the emperor, right? That was mostly spent anyway in all these systems for military reasons, right? This was the tax used to supply the army. In part, it really came just at this point in nature, right, to some extent, but it was also monetized, especially in these more, say, commercially dynamic centers. The Goths, for example, used the Roman armories that were still active in Italy at this point. They controlled the cities, of course. Of course, we cannot deny that there were also phenomena of appropriation and colonization, but it seems that at least initially these were contained in just the Po Valley and Tuscany without much prejudice. Thus, for the actually vast, and when I say vast, I really mean vast, because they were across different countries, the Mediterranean, the assets of the Roman aristocracy that in Italy were pretty much founded in the center and in the south of the peninsula and in Sicily. The north was sort of more militarized, more also barbarized to an extent already. It's interesting that the Po Valley in Tuscany would also be like the basis of Longobarд power later, that would actually bring during the Middle Ages to the most highly ordered and civilized and urbanized kingdom of Italy, naturally on the previous Roman basis, but also because the Longobards had fixed a unitary kingdom there. This other element is important because the Goths would, as soldiers, would, and in order to control the peninsula, would be settled by their same leaders, naturally, with all Roman, say, advice and logic, alongside, for example, the Alpine or the Apenninic passes, places that were not very populated, and also that therefore had been depopulated historically, and so actually could support communities of warriors that would have been supported, as we've seen, just by the imperial tax, and that therefore allowed these guys to control strategically the country, but without interfering much with the Roman population. Of course, the Goths were settled in the very heart of the major Italian cities at this point, that were among the largest still in the empire, if you want to consider it just still there in the west, and surely like these were the largest cities in the west, right? But overall, right, these elements would have been easily just integrated, diluted, coexisting. Right? There was no reason why even functionally, that they would have created problems in this context. There is also another factor to consider, that if the major subtractions of property happened at the expense of middle and small landowners, this happened because, as we've seen, the same Roman senators allowed for it to happen, the purpose being accentuating that preponderance of powerful Roman citizens on the poorer ones, right? And this is something was going on for quite a while. For example, Augustine had denounced this already during the 5th century. The Christian authors had been always very sensitive to this problem, and they were right, because the system was sclerotizing otherwise, even if it was, as we've seen, so actually functional and sort of better off, like compared to the neighbors. But that's not because it wasn't taking like a worse trend compared to what it could be. And the Goths, of course, would simply fit in, right? There is also another banal aspect that, however, maybe is not so banal, that is, for the Goths, that for the following Germanic settlers in Italy, we've seen it well with the Longobards, the fact is that they really settled on a territorial frame that was already very definite, right? It was very different, as we were saying before, for example, from Northern Gaul or Britain. Italy, again, was massively urbanized. It was heavily interconnected. It had a great control in the countryside from the cities, right? It was very central in the Mediterranean. It had the importantly monetary economy compared to other lands. There was all an infrastructural setting that defined essentially these centers just by themselves. Like the Germanic rulers of Italy wouldn't really alter this. They didn't have nor the will nor the capacity to do so. Nor really there any good reason for even thinking that that would have been the case. On the contrary, they wanted to preserve that as much as possible, and that's why, say, I don't know, the Goths as the Longobards ended up always ruling from the cities and civilizing, say, having a very high level of literacy, taking care of that civil administration that allowed them to run the country definitely a more functional way. The city was the cornerstone of such frame. It was really the basis of an articulation that was ordained with eventually more mobile and variegated configurations through the various ages. For example, the regions, the dioceses, the prefectures, the provinces. There was all this heavily superimposed net that functionalized the entire country. The cities were also the place of education of the elites, for example. Here, the landowners, the tax collectors, etc., followed local careers. They obtained the urban offices. They constituted those senates that in the imperial rhetoric would have had to reproduce everywhere the same senatorial curia of the urbs herself. Right? Remember, these cities had been founded historically because there had to be an identical copy of Rome in her metaphysical perfection and centrality in the universe. And this remained in the deep awareness also of these cities, while the system was falling apart in a, what Marxists would say, a superstructural way. Actually, the cornerstone of the local rule would remain, as we've seen many times, with the, for example, the development of the communes in the Middle Ages, heavily traditional as far as the sense of not just freemen, but in this sense noblemen in arms. These communities really were. It's like before when we were saying that there were also Roman soldiers next to the Gothic ones. Well, most of these troops would have rather been the militias that were already autonomously organizing in the various cities that in Italy never died out, even in the so-called darkest age of the Middle Ages, together with their political identity, their municipal pride, their institutional mechanisms, their infrastructural system. This is so crucial for understanding also how the Germans would actually land in Italy and how they would run it. There was no other way but the city. That here, however, was still in control of the Roman elite. And that's why the Goth is so much of a soldier and also deployed and settled, say, in the centralized areas after all. And we don't have to forget either that aside from the church, today we will not talk about that so much, but the papacy is already overwhelmingly powerful in Europe entirely. Like, we're not talking about just like a provincial reality. There is the great aristocracy that in Italy was the one still represented by the Senate of Rome. Right? The Gothic court was in Ravenna, and as we've seen, even in there, you had the Germans from one side, the Romans from another, the king in the middle, and discussing how to run this dominion. But there was also a Senate in Rome. It was the Senate, right? It was not just a random thing, and Theodoric was also quite obsequious towards it as well. Through the Varie of Cassiodorus, we learn of these very cities, right? The reference to their possessores, defensores, curiales. These were all Roman officials in centers like Pavia, Trent, Parma, Forlì. Banally, I talked about Parma in the series of medieval regions, in this case cities. So if you're interested in perspective, we started from late antiquity there. You can see this continuity and how important it was also for the later centuries. And these are just some of the most, say, specific references, right? And these are all northern cities, by the way. Pavia would be it had already been very important in the Po Valley, and it would be the capital of the future Longobard and Italic kingdom. Trent was very strategic. These other centers were, again, all these important Roman cities, after all, and important roads, and all their strategic relevance. And so, from Cassiodorus' work, we see the city dominating. Rhetorically, everything is dominated by the idea of the urban civilitas. Again, that series on the medieval Italian cities that all start from as videos from late antiquity, in fact, and sometimes even probably from the foundation in the previous centuries, illustrate, I think, beautifully how this civility was maintained throughout the following centuries, and how central, as we were saying before, for example, in the Longobard kingdom, all these centers in turn were. And this is also the place, the city, the urban environment, where the first and most important phenomena of osmosis between the Gothic and Neo-Latin elites would have taken place. Right? This is where the actual meeting with, the chieftain arriving with the army, and the Roman officials taking care of this and allowing for their lodging, like telling them where to settle the troops, how to organize the system, how to receive the supplies. This is where it would take place. That's where it had always been taking place, also in the previous centuries, as we've seen with Odoacer's 4 bands, and even before that. Now, the rhetorical celebrations of the harmonious coexistence between Goths and Romans. So, in this sense, the first, the defenders, the armed defenders of the latter, tended paradoxically to stress this separation between the Romans and the Germans. And historically speaking, it's not too good. We have seen what level of idealism there is behind this. So this paradoxically obscures our same understanding of how this coexistence actually happened. Right? How did this osmosis really happen? We can't imagine it as it was doing right now, listing how, say, they would have first met and arranged things together. We know, however, just to tell you how things were actually not that separated to the extreme at all, that there were men of Gothic origin, for example, that covered also civil offices. We have already pointed out how in Theodoric's army there were, first of all, warriors that were not just, and chieftains that were not just Gothic or Germanic, but there were also Neo-Latins among them. Unfortunately, however, the evidence that we have remain, as you can imagine, very individual, scattered, so really anecdotic almost. They're still very important because if you look at the total available, still they are relevant in that sense. Also modest is our knowledge of, for example, city churches and their bishops in these years that would have really told us, otherwise if known, how the Goths and the Romans would have really familiarized with one another. This is because obviously the episcopate was the fundamental skeleton of the Christian society, and it had naturally, we made multiple videos on, say, how the church was really created, even just in parallel to the skeleton of the Romano-Hellenistic state, and within which she had grown. And so obviously being founded on the same cities. This was for the entire empire, right? And this institution herself opened to the concept of brotherhood, right? Of osmosis between, especially the elites of different peoples. Also, the church was at this point very, especially in Italy, very elite managed, right? In the sense that there were still very powerful senatorial families that run the business in this, as we've seen, highly civilized and urbanized context. It's rather after the Gothic War. I made a video about Gregory the Great and Saint Equitius. Think about Saint Benedict. There is all another, say, temper, like the opening to the rural populations that were becoming truly the most important aspect of the story, politically, demographically. So when the cities substantially declined, but never disappeared, never lost that centrality and preponderance, because still this countryside was dominated by the city. So it's rather another way of ruling from the cities, rather than, of course, the city declining in a secondary position. The episcopate, as a consequence, was a very sought-after office by itself. There was already that complaint for simony that would reactivate together with the great medieval civilization as the cities came back to grow in the later centuries. Think about all the instances of the Reformation of the Church in Gregorian times. We've seen it. This had all sort of happened already, and we're already there. And this also is a very important element of continuity from Roman to medieval times. Simony, of course, was about the acquisition of the office by paying it, or influencing the election, say in this corrupted fashion. And this election, in fact, was, as you know, belonging instead to all the local community, to all the faithful, the clergy and the laymen as well within the diocese. However, in practice, it was the essentially the fact of an informal elite of priests and lay notables of the cities that really made the church work. It was in the creation of these informal electoral bodies, besides in the individual acquisition of the office, that we have to look at if we want to see really what was happening between the Romans and the Germans. But we know too few about the episcopal elections in general, practically nothing in Theodoric's times. We have, however, in spite of the pretty sorrowful state of the documentation in the 5th and the 6th century, some evidence of Gothic bishops in Italy. For example, Gudila in Sarsinha, that is on the Apennines in central Italy. And this Gothic bishop is remembered in a text by Cassiodorus that is also very interesting because it refers to the problems of the local city government. We know, however, of a factor that slowed down the episcopal way to the osmosis between Goths and Romans. That is to say, of course, as you understand, the adherence of the Gothic elites to the Arian version of Christianity that, of course, had been defined as heretical in the ecclesiastical councils of the 4th and the 5th century. again, we know what Arianism in this sense was about. It was just a political shout-out that the Germans had used when they were still in the Barbaricum to feel that sort of autonomous from the empire, even making a bit of provocative counterculture as the ones who in theory would have brought down the empire, and actually tried to salvage as much of it as possible when they settled into its lands. And so it wasn't even such an important issue, nor much of an obstacle, just as we've seen in the general demic integration. Ecclesiastically wise, however, it was, of course, a problem, because with now an overwhelming Catholic population already by this point, Italy is, there's barely any pagan left, and everybody's Catholic. By the way, we do not know of significant heresies, etc. It's mostly just in the east, right, of the empire. Like, the Goths could have never even imposed any kind of, say, religious policy that was different from the one of the rest of the population, right? In Spain, this would actually happen, but the situation there is slightly more complicated in terms of political unity. In Italy, the Goths had this jewel that still worked unitarily, that didn't have essentially internal problems of control. The Iberian Peninsula was a total mess, actually. So nobody would have been so foolish to sort of go against the main, say, stream and just to be overwhelmed and drown in it. The later issues between the Catholics and the Arians that also brought to the Byzantine intervention in Italy were at an elite level, right? We're not aware of significant issues like in a down the line, right? Of let's say the everyday life of people. It was rather a struggle between the elites, and within the same Gothic elites, by the way, as you know, because there was a Catholic party as well within the Goths. And again, this is something we will see in another video, right? In fact, in any case, the most important issues in civil life in Italy in the age of Theodoric do not seem to have stemmed from Arianism at all, but from the aforementioned imbalance in the social system that were, as we've seen, also pretty transversal between the Romans and the Goths, right? There were these cities that, as we've seen, were the cornerstone of the political, juridical, and administrative, and also economical frame that founded essentially also the same countryside production, and entailed, of course, this pre-orderly system of exchanges and communications, also long distances. So this means that there was an efficient administration still standing and operating essentially as usual, right? Of course, in the 6th century, Italy was not, say, as dynamic as it was in the previous ones. This is true basically for any region at this point. Everything has sort of degraded, but it's not like that net founded in antiquity had collapsed yet. However, speaking of the aforementioned social imbalance, in Cassiodorus' Epistolae, we find, next to the solemnization of the Civilitas and of the urban values, also, in fact, the complaint about, for example, how poorly the roads were upkept, how sort of difficult it was to move by river, and worse, we find some indication that it's the private magnates that basically are destroying the public system. Some of them, for example, are creating some fisheries that block the passage along important rivers. For example, the Mincio, the Oglio, the Serchio, that is the Auser. These are northern Italy. But even the Arno and the same Tiber are blocked like this. Now you may say, well, but you said that essentially it's exactly in these regions that the Goths are settled, that the urban structure is less developed, and you don't find much of this in central southern Italy. Yes, but there are also less rivers in southern Italy. These are, say, all places that, as we've seen before, so the cities indicated and by the same Cassiodorus in terms of activity, etc., like important routes of communication. These people who act are Roman. And so you see here rather, as we were just observing, this degradation, this corruption of the system, just by some sort of exhaustion, some sort of collapse that late antiquity was heading toward sooner or later. Now, after Theodoric's death, a hostile party to his young son and his regent mother famously formed. And the party had coalesced around nephew of Theodoric, the noble Theodad. Now, this guy would have been remembered, first of all, as a massive landowner, right? In fact, he was described as rich of the greatest part of the lands in Tuscany, aggressor of the neighbor's goods, because a neighbor of his seemed to him like a sort of disgrace. This is interesting because the Longobards actually were said by classical sources to have hated neighbors, and that they were proud to basically be at war contemporarily against all of them, so you would have not liked to be a neighbor of the Longobards. And so here you see perhaps the same thing in this Germanic mentality, the idea of being a major, great ruler, a hero, whatever, and whoever was living next to you was sort of just like somebody to prevaricate, to extend your rule on. And so you see that this Theodad was actually a failure in civilization, right? He was just like a destroyer of the order, somebody that was thinking first about himself and then about like what this could mean for the system. Naturally, Theodoric had been a completely different ruler. He had been very civilized, very intelligent, very wise, right, and still energetic and warlike. He was a great hero, but he understood how to make things run, right? And this is ultimately what the Imperial Catholic tradition is. Theodad was not really like this. Naturally, also these social issues are described sporadically. We don't have like this, okay, everybody's talking about it all the time. There is, however, in the general dimension that we just illustrated, clamorous mark of the crisis of, if you want, of public authority. This is not just about of urban civility, unless you extend it to the degree that, as we've seen, the city sort of ruled the entire system. So there is some special decay, let's say, in the decline. This is a leitmotif, like in antiquity, from quite a while, especially of the lay city culture. Like, while the bishops remain fundamentally faithful to their mission, they remain within the city, they help organizing the military defenses, the welfare for the poor, etc. The great landowners that in late antiquity run the the borough system. This is not to say that the church didn't have a lot of land, but it functioned differently. Like they weren't private, right? They didn't inherit, etc. So these greater families, as we've seen, they controlled these immense territories. What did they care about the single cities, right? The latifundium makes you so rich that just leave it there and you still are rich, right? Essentially, you don't have to commit yourself too much to run a city that is sort of, say, not necessarily falling to pieces, but still costs a lot to upkeep. And so basically lots of officials bail out, even though they're still there, right? We've seen them, as we were saying, looking at the Colosseum's steps, names, but they are, generally speaking, coming less to their original duty that Romanity had also been a lot about in this urban civil sense. Certainly, also the general condition of the population wasn't as good as in the previous centuries. We know that, for example, literacy had declined substantially. There was, for example, in Verona, an illustris, which means illustrious, girl, like a child, that was so famous because she had been educated in the letters, right? And of course, this girl would have been like sort of substantially educated. It's not because she was illustrious because she was just literate, right? She was really like a bit of a prodigy, but still in a context in which presumably most people didn't, even of her, presumably at least upper social status would have been educated like in the same way. There is one aspect of written culture that I think is extremely eloquent to observe the continuity of the cities in this system. That is the epigraphic production. You know what epigraphy is? Essentially, it's everything that is written outside, right? In either sculpted or like graffiti or whatever. We're talking also about monuments, statues, say not the statues per se, but incisions, like something written in properly in honor, especially of these important elements of society. We actually see this practice, let's say, spreading from large segments of the civil and military society in Italy since the 3rd century AD. This is important because the 3rd century had been the century of the crisis, and there is a sense here probably to lock in, to say reinvest locally, and to show who was really the more powerful socially in the city. And so these families show off and say, we are this clan, we are so powerful, we are so rich, we covered these offices, we are so important. This is an attitude that you find directly 1 millennium later in the same cities in the communal era, with the clans doing exactly the same thing. The so-called Italian campanilism, which comes from campanile bell tower, that says like my city is better than yours or whatever. It sort of starts from this point. Like every city had that major pride, and I made recently a video about ancient Florence, for example, that shows you how, like, yes, the cities were all like a copy of Rome, but it's not like that they were not born under a specific star and that they weren't protected by this or that deity that conferred different character or whatever. And cities were so proud of this. This is very typical of Italy, the autonomy of the local community. The fact that these were still technically citizens in arms, and as far as we know, because we see it throughout, for example, the Longobards period, they always contributed with militias, also in open field, with the royal army or whatever. So they are that important and still are at this point. We also see high-level lay literary production founded on the rhetorical and philosophical studies that were already proper of the Romano-Italic aristocracy. That was much more traditional, for example, than the Greek Byzantine one that had sort of much more standardized, sort of bureaucratic curricula, right, that were managed by the Imperial autocracy. And that in fact also took on a more domestic and private character in teaching, for example. It's notorious that the Romano-Italic aristocracy was legitimately the sort of most proud, educated, like properly like the depository of the old tradition. These families were incredibly ancient. When we look during the Gothic War, many of these families fleeing to Constantinople, they bring with them an incredible amount of manuscripts of incredible knowledge. They are very sophisticated. They're very they're really noble, right? To an extent that like Romanity had never seen in that truly sort of Italic legacy, right? And this was the fruit of the oligarchization of the system in part, but also, of course, like the legacy, the Roman legacy of Italy, that had always remained central in that imperial origin. And this is also another aspect that people tend to forget. They see like the Roman Empire as a sort of cauldron in which everything changed, was multicultural, but no, more or less the same peoples maintained essentially always the same identity and character, especially in the West. Like at least in Italy, really molded Spain and Gaul and part of the Balkans, admittedly. But let's say this is because it was the Italics that the Italians actually colonized these other countries as the guys who made the empire, and so no other people did ever the same. In the empire, because of course so central Italy remained anyway. So in this context, the elaboration of wider, more solemn, and also rich writings have a strongly ideological character, right? They are loaded with factual information. As we said before, they essentially told you the status of this or that clan or this patriarch, and they're so therefore the most important sources, because they show from one side what these people were, but also what they were sort of aspiring to, right? How they saw the world, or how they wished the world to be. And sublimating everything in, or surpassing in a philosophical sense, both Christian and not, because yes, these were all Christian Christian families at the top, but of course they cultivated. These were the families in which paganism, in a cultural sense, had lasted most. Like, these had been some of the most critical elements against Christianity, because they thought that they could upheld the heroic standards of temporal and spiritual power in one, because they were so powerful and so elite that they weren't scared of that. Constantine had to create Constantinople not to rule from Rome for different reasons, but one was to get out of the way of the Roman Senate, because it was that powerful and sort of unsufferable for anyone who wanted to sort of prevaricate him. There are also hints about the difficulties in the dramas of present times, right? And to this category also belongs the most famous work of the senator Severinus Boethius, that was also one of the protagonists of the first crisis of Theodoric's reign, And in the first, actually, serious cracks between the royal court and the senatorial aristocracy. And exactly in the fire of this crisis is suspected to have plotted against the king in connection with other Roman senators. He wrote famously, like one of the most important works in Western civilization, the Consolation of Philosophy, so the Consolation of Philosophy, or in philosophy, one, in which you can read that sense of disappointment, disillusionment regarding the continuity of Roman glory, right? What are these gods? What has the world gotten to, right? It's not like they weren't thinking about this, like especially the nobility, like grieving for this, really for this situation, which seemed like we were the world rulers, and now we have to simply have truly some what we're seen now as a tyrant in this, in fact, less flattering situation of distrust of like the guy would be put to death, right? So it's not like everything evidently was fine. The international, we'll have to talk about, of course, things more eventually, because there were all some international dynamics bringing to this sense of distrust, this apparent paranoia that Theodoric fell into. This is important because just think about the pressure that all involved really had, and especially like a sovereign like Theodoric in the in the realization of all the difficulties, of all the incumbent threats, of the instability that that world really was starting to show anyway. And so there is this phrase from the Consolation of Philosophy that speaks of also the nobiliar ambition of the Romans that had apparently brought down the same Roman glory. This is naturally, Boethius is a bit, that's really hypocrite, but of course he is denouncing a dynamic that was long, in fact, present in Romanity, in so many other systems, and that had been a problem, right? Had like this lack of balance, this depauperation of, say, the majority in favor of a few people that, however, couldn't handle it anymore, and found themselves now in this risky situation, wanted to come back within the empire, having these gods, right, controlling them. We're talking the elite specifically, right? The people believed completely different things. It's not like Boethius was freeing colonists or something, like, so that's a bit like the paradox of the senatorial issues, but it's still a very intelligent work. And this passage says, so that nobody may forget how empty, how useless was the title of noble. This is important among a people like the Romans, who had thought that they were like a stock of heroes. Of course, traditional society contemplated, the hierarchy of estates, and so it's not like there had ever been a fully egalitarian society. But you see, the Germans were sort of closer to that, even though especially the Goths were so heavily hierarchical now, basically as the Romans in Italy, because of this same osmosis that we described. But the Romans had sort of always recognized the idea that it was something more primitively authentic, and sort of the simpler and more warlike way of life that is also these barbarians displayed in the face of a Roman civilization that was, of course, superior, but that was sort of forgetting how to awaken that force that had created this world domination. And so the barbarian had always been a very convenient and polysemic model to counterpose to the Rome. Boethius says if we speak of the claritas means fame, like somebody that is, clear, literally, that's the etymology, like it's clear to anyone, everybody knows, everybody recognizes because it's so manifestly shining, right? The principle of divine transfiguration started from the literal aura, like Christ in the desert in front of the apostles, like the saints did, that would have been identified as God, right? But it says this claritas belongs to others. Nobility is in fact a good quality that derives from the fame of the ancestors. And if there is something good in nobility, I think that only this, it is only this that is to the nobleman is imposed the burden not to degenerate from the virtues of the ancestors. Listen to these people who come on my channel and say, I descend from this guy, I come from the... are you say morally, personally, and culturally a person even remotely comparable to your ancestors? Do you think that a person who thinks that, who is that, first of all, comes on YouTube to write random comments like this on a secondary channel just because of some, I don't know what, like nobody knows, right? My ancestors were these people, yes, and then what are you? Can you even be called people, right? Compared to that, listen to Boethius. Each kind of man is born on earth from a same origin. One is the father, in fact, of everyone. Talking about God, of course. Is the single most imperial Catholic belief. You think about this, like, I come from these people, I have this ancestry, like, do you understand that the reason why you can't distinguish this is that, first of all, as a human you fell out of divinity, and secondly, you can't revert to that, and that this condition, what you look like, you are just interpreting as some sort of zoological determinism and materialism, which means that you're basically done for and you don't have any capacity of saving your own soul in the firmament, just like a glorious hero of the mythological past. Never mind. Boethius says, thus was a noble seed to give origin to all the mortals. Why do you make so much noise on the stock and the ancestors? If you consider your first origin in your author God, you will understand that nobody falls off the stalk, if not he who detaches from that origin with his vices or with the research of divorce. In other words, the way you are as a human should just make you feel ashamed of yourself. And your entire life should be about coming back to God, and this is what your ancestors actually believed. You don't even know what it means. So, when you look at this Gothic hegemony in Italy, you will realize that it's happened within a frame that it wasn't from a long time of quiet and orderly socio-economical development, especially, right? The form was something, but the substance was changing in distribution. And on this, already before the death of Theodoric and the conflict for his succession, say internal breaks within the elites started. Tensions between city and countryside, the rarefaction of the powerful elites that were becoming thus all much more fragile and easier to knock out. And that therefore we're looking ever more at a longer range, like to intrigue and rivalry also within themselves. And it is very difficult to see a coexistence at this point between this order and the one of other peoples, or even just the general population. It would have continued hadn't the Gothic War destroyed the entire system, made it actually worse for everybody involved. Anyway, this was also the chance to restart from sort of way more stable basis that would have been shown by the great medieval Italian civilization. However, at this point, the time frame necessary to such changes, or the will to fix it, was not really there, right? We know that late antiquity declined anyway, and so it's difficult to say. Some of you asked me, like, what would have happened to Italy had the Goths remained? It's difficult. Likely there would have been still a continuity with that level of wealth distribution that, as we've seen, was the most balanced in the world, really, and that level of urbanization, and that sense that things could be really managed at a higher level. But in this, it's possible that paradoxically also the cities would have gradually lost their autonomy, or at least they would have not developed it so intensely as in the Middle Ages. It's not surprising that when Justinian wanted the war against the Goths of Italy in the mid-6th century, the Goths still spoke their language. As we've seen, they had been in many ways separated from the rest of the system. It was in the hands of an elite that had not allowed really for any full mix, like it would happen with the Longobards, with a full homogeneous uniformity in the way their rule sort of asserted itself, also with the support of the local people. Still elites, but very different from the ones existing before the Gothic War. I think this is like an interesting setting of considerations to reflect on further. I already made something about Ostrogothic Italy. I think it was one of the earliest videos on Schwerpunkt that I began with it. Let me check. Especially the Ostrogoths. I have some... there is not too much about the gods, really. But, Ostrogothic history. Yep. Last video made on the Ostrogoths more than 1 year ago. 6 videos, 187 views. Well, it happens. Not too much. We talked more about the Visigoths recently. Yep, we should talk more about this whole Gothic history. 17 videos, in fact. 307 views. Not the individual videos that actually received lots of views, but you see the strange thing here. Well, okay, some of the most recent videos actually have more views. But you have this interesting things about, I don't know, the Visigothic kings and Ostrogothic Italy, etc. What do people watch the most? The Geats. History of a Norse people. you see how disproportionately nonsensical the the general pseudo-historical interest really is out there, right? It may be that, I don't know, maybe they watch the Geats because nobody made a video about them on YouTube, but it's possible. But in general, right, the impression is that people tend to watch what they think is sort of more ethnic in nature and not more complexly developed, civilizationally speaking, and more difficult to understand, right? And that's not good, right? The content I make is designed to be a whole, right? Not to be sort of individually peeled, like for whichever, say, claustrophobic fixation you want to pursue purposely. Anyway, we'll like a bit of drama, a bit of criticism, a bit of thing. That I'm satisfied with your, well, no, I will admit it, I'm not satisfied with how the channel goes to some extent at least. But in fact, this is the point. It's always double thread. Every hand is a winner, every hand is a loser, right? It's just how you handle it. Indeed, there is more that can be done, but overall I like that I see people that are coming and sort of being a bit more careful, right? Maybe actually the general mass doesn't. Like I have here more views and sort of less watch length in proportion than before the time, but I think it's also normal because like it happens, the more subscribers you have, and this is the trend, that this is the second law of thermodynamics, where you can't do anything about that. The larger the system, the more let's say inefficient it is. In any case, let's see more in the future what Gothic history brings, and I'm very glad, of course, to talk about it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.